My name is Kate Nielsen, and I'm the archivist here at the Whyte Museum. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that the Whyte is situated in Treaty 7 territory on the traditional lands of many Indigenous groups, including the Yahe Nakota, Blackfoot, Tsuut'ina, Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, Dene, Mountain Cree, and Métis nations. In keeping with the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous Peoples, and in support of calls to action number 67 through 70, as set out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, I recognize that the Whyte has a unique responsibility towards the Indigenous people of the Bow Valley, the Canadian Rockies, and beyond. It's our responsibility as a learning institution and community gathering place to acknowledge the many centuries of Indigenous history that shaped these lands, as well as the past and present challenges experienced by Indigenous people. I encourage everyone to visit indigenousarchives.whyte.org and see the Hosting Indigenous Community Relations displays in the Archives Reading Room for more information and helpful resources. I'm so happy to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate and learn more about the Calgary Mountain Club with the help of our esteemed speakers. The CMC is one of the most renowned mountaineering clubs in Canada, and its members have achieved many first ascents in addition to taking on some of the most technically challenging routes in the Canadian Rockies. It was an honor to accept many of the CMC's early records into the Whyte Archives last November with the help of Keith Grimes and Ken Weens. I was also thrilled to see the far-reaching public interest spurred by the donation, including articles published by Grit Magazine, CBC, the Calgary Herald, and Canada's History Magazine. The Whyte is one of the finest privately owned and operated art and heritage museums in Canada. We hold the largest art collection dedicated to the Canadian Rockies in the world, with over 10,000 pieces spanning the early 1800s to present day. The Whyte Archives contains over 800 archival fonds dating from the mid-19th century onwards, including photographs, films, sound recordings, and documents related to people and groups who have lived or traveled through the Canadian Rockies. We also have 3 libraries containing a mix of rare and contemporary publications: the Art Library, Archives Library, and the Alpine Club of Canada Library. Thanks to the generosity of the CMC, we are now the permanent home of the club's archival records, including articles, photographs, and meeting minutes. We also hold a logbook dating from 1960, which includes first-hand accounts written by the club's earliest members. Many entries were accompanied by original photographs and drawings. Contributions by Billy Davidson, John Laughlin, Don Baccarat, Brian Greenwood, and others are featured. Some of these materials, including the logbook, are currently on display in the Archives Reading Room, and you can also learn more through the Whyte's online database at archives.whyte.org. So before we get started with tonight's event, I have a couple of quick housekeeping notes to pass along as well. For those of you enjoying drinks tonight, when you are done with your drinks, please drop your cans and glasses off at the table in the Rummel Room towards the back of the museum over there. And there will also be washrooms available by the main entrance next to the coat check area where you came in. So I would now like to welcome our speakers for the evening, Chick Scott, Judy Sterner, and Andrew Brash, who will share the story of the CMC with us and shed light on how the club has evolved over the past 64 years. So please join me in welcoming Chick, Judy, and Andrew.
Thank you, Kate. Wow, and it's great to see everybody. I have to say I know almost everybody in the audience, and I'm sure at least half of you, maybe even more, are members of the CMC. So welcome. This is your story. Of the 3 of us, I go back the longest, so I get the first part, the birth of the CMC. So where did the CMC come from? It really came from the fact that the Alpine Club of Canada at that time just wasn't meeting the needs of younger, adventurous, full of life people. After the war, many young people came from Austria and Germany mainly to Canada. They knew how to ski a little bit, could climb a bit. They could sing and yodel and drink a glass of wine, and they were looking for some fun. But you know, the Alpine Club of Canada was British, and it was stuffy. And it was. I'm writing a book on the Alpine Club of Canada. And at that time, it was a very British and conservative group of people. So in 1960, the Calgary Mountain Club was formed in May. It had some of the most remarkable people amongst the founding members. Probably the most notable being Brian Greenwood. He was there. He had come to Canada in 1956, but had already established himself as a pretty good and serious climber. And he would go on to dominate climbing in this part of the world for another 2 decades. Glenn Bowles, who became one of the most respected mountaineers and artists in this part of the world, he was a founding member. And Don Vockroth. Don, from Drumheller, was pretty young in those days, but he was already establishing himself as one of the leading climbers in Canada. And he was climbing with this guy a bunch of the time, Lloyd McKay. Lloyd was from Nova Scotia, got a training as a lawyer, came west, joined the club in 1960. He went on to establish a law practice here in Banff and became just a really, just such an important member of the community here. And then there was a bunch of people from Germany and Austria, young, just come out here, they loved Canada. There were jobs that paid well, lots to eat, lots to drink, and a future. These 3 guys, I knew them all quite well. Dieter Robach, Gunty Prins, and Klaus Hahn. They were part of that group. This guy, Heinz Kahl, he was a founding member. He had already established himself as a leading climber. He had actually been with Hans Moser and Leo Grelmar on the first ascent at Direttissima in 1957. And then there were some pretty hot climbing ladies too, and pretty cute too. I remember Inga. This is Inga Steinbach. She was about 5 years older than me, and she was a ball of fire. And she could climb like a hot damn. She was, I think, a physiotherapist from Austria. And she, with Don Vockroth, she almost made the first ascent of the Bowl route in 1965. They got almost to the top. They had to turn back. And they rappelled down the old-fashioned Dulfer-Sitz rappels in the dark with a flashlight in their teeth off the bowl. And some of you, I'm sure, in the audience have climbed the bowl. It's pretty steep. And then there were these 2, Lilo Schmidt on the right from Germany and Betty King. Lilo was the first woman to climb the Direttissima route. And Betty made the first ascent of King's Chimney. It's named after her. Yeah. And this is where the CMC went. Although Yamnuska, as we call it, really is the Stony Nakota Mountain, it's also the Calgary Mountain Club Mountain. It's, that's where we went. We climbed. We fell in love with the place, with the Chinook winds and the ravens gliding on the wind. It was a very special place for us. Here's just a couple of old pictures. There's Don Vockroth on the bowl with a ski jacket and a construction hard hat, trying to figure out how to climb steep terrain. There were no such thing as climbing classes or climbing courses in those days. Here's a picture, interesting picture taken by Gunty Prins from the top of the red shirt route, looking down at Heinz Call as he leads up the last pitch on the red shirt route in 1962 when they did the first ascent. And here's a picture of another Brit, Dick Lofthouse, on Bottleneck Route in the early 60s as well. And the Calgary Mountain Club began to attract some of the teenagers, the young people, like this guy, Charlie Locke. He joined the club about 1962 when he would have been 16 or 17. Along with his friend, Donnie Gardner, they just lived across the street from each other. We all know Donnie as the great skier, but he was a pretty good climber in those days too. And here's a picture, Donnie must have taken this picture of Charlie Locke in the winter of 1964 when they did a traverse along the ridge of Mount Rundle. And they would have been 18 years old. I don't know whether their parents knew where they were, but And another great feat that they did, just the next summer, Donnie and Charlie traversed 23 summits in 6 days. They started on Mount Fay, they went all around Moraine Lake, the 10 Peaks, over Hungabi, Ringrose, Glacier Peak, Lefroy, down into Abbott Pass, over Victoria, Collier, Pope's Peak, and down to Lake Louise. They were 19 years old. And for anybody, well, there's not a lot of young people in the audience, but if there's anybody out there who wants something to do, I don't think that's ever been repeated. I've never heard of it. Chris might know, maybe Alan knows, but I don't know if anybody has ever repeated that incredible traverse. Winter climbing was also a big thing. Here's Brian Greenwood at the top of Mount Hungabi in the winter of 1966. And here's Eckhard Grassman, some of us remember Eckhard, at the top of Mount Victoria in the winter of 1968. And here's a fabulous picture. There they go. Boy, there's a couple of guys with attitude. And at least the guy on the right has attitude. And those of you who knew him, Brian had attitude. And Charlie on the left, it's actually in the Yamnuska parking lot. I mean, you know what the Yamnuska parking lot looks like today. That's what it looked like back then. But in 1966, they went alpine and put the first route up the north face of Mount Temple. But the club did more than climb. They actually were quite organized in those days. So here's Klaus Hahn and Doug Wan, and they're in charge of the Sunwalk to Giant Slalom. So from about 1963 or 4 until 67, 68, the Calgary Mountain Club organized this big race on Parker Ridge on the May long weekend. They had the army out with tents and they had timing devices and everything. And they even got Canada's national ski team out there. So there's a young Nancy Green accepting her trophy from Charlie Nelson of the Skier Ski Shop. And about that time, the club started to develop their reputation, not only for hard climbing, but for hard partying. Here's a guy by the name of Pete Cooper, who actually wrote for the Albertan newspaper. But here he is with all the bottles that they had picked up from around the campground at one of those races. And there's the newspaper clipping. So it was different. It was different than the Alpine Club. Yeah. And the club also built huts. They really built huts. So this is their first hut. 1964, they built it at the top of the 3-4 couloir. A guy by the name of Graham Cooper, Pete Cooper's brother, was killed during the construction by a stone fall, and that's why it was known for many years as the Graham Cooper hut. It has since been replaced by the Neil Colgan hut. And they built this one up on the Goats Plateau on Castle Mountain. And yeah, it's still there. Well, it isn't, but a hut is still there, because just last summer, just last autumn, this hut was replaced. The Alpine Club replaced it with a brand new, much nicer and more modern version. And during those years, I was also a member of the club, starting about 1963, and I had a few adventures. Here I am with my pals on the left, Donnie Gardner, Neil Liskey, and then in the blue, Charlie Locke, and then me smoking a pipe, trying to look like a Swiss guide. In 1967, in the summer, in May, we skied the Great Whyte Ski Traverse, and there's the classic picture of the four of us at the end. And then at Christmas, December 22nd, I think, we stood on top. Donnie Gardner, Eckhard Grassman, and I reached the top of Mount Assiniboine for the first winter ascent. It was an epic climb, and when we came down and we got warmed up in one of Erling Strome's huts, one of his cabins, then we skied out and drove back to Calgary. So Brian Greenwood and Charlie and Eckhard, and Archie Simpson had been with us on that trip. They had not made the top, but the six of us went over to Brian Greenwood's house for a Christmas Eve dinner. Had a fabulous roast goose that Tony Greenwood cooked, and sitting with us around the table was this guy, John Jones, soon to become Dr. Jones, an English climber from the Sheffield area. At least that's where he went to university. He actually grew up in London, where his father owned a pub. But John had come to Canada to do a PhD in geology at U of C, and he was bunking in with Brian Greenwood and Tony. And so he was the start of really the big wave of British climbers that would go for another 15 years. And at about the time John arrived, pretty soon after, I headed off to Europe and the Himalayas and up here to the mountains, to Sunshine Village, and was gone from Calgary for a long time. But this lady showed up, Judy Sterner, and Dr. Judy Sterner, she is now, and she's going to take the show from here. Judy.
Okay, we'll now take up my part of the story. How does a California girl like me wind up hanging out with the notorious Calgary Mountain Club? So I started climbing in 1969, and at that time, before I met the Calgary Mountain Club, I had the real privilege to climb with a number of women that were actively climbing in the valley. Margaret Young, I climbed with a number of times. She had been part of the first women's expedition to Mount McKinley, or Denali, as it's known now. As well, I climbed with Elaine Matthews, Bev Johnson, Anne-Marie Rizzi, and Sibylla Hechtel. All of those women in the early 70s were the first to climb some of the big walls in Yosemite. So I had a pretty good introduction to rock climbing in the valley. And then I met up with the Calgary Mountain Club. So I think some of you, I know I can see some of you that know this person extremely well, Bugs McKeith. And in the valley in those days, and often it probably still happens, annual pilgrimages of climbers in the spring and fall to climb there. And the Calgary Mountain Club were amongst those. And it was a bit hard distinguishing in the valley because as we know, a lot of the Calgary Mountain Club were British. And so there was the Brits who were Calgary Mountain Club, and they were the real Brits who'd come directly from Britain at the time. But, and that's where I met Bugs. I climbed with him there, and sometimes in 71 and 72. He was the Brits were the Calgary Mountain Club, a lot of good campfires in Camp 4, sitting around the campfire. And some of the American climbers thought this was a little bit too kumbaya, singing folk songs around a nice fire. However, Bugs McKeith not only could play the guitar and sing, but he did a lot of nightly entertainment. Claims his beard was considerably diminished by the end of the season. So, despite having already known Bugs McKeith, but I was introduced to other members of the Calgary Mountain Club, and in 1971, I didn't plan on coming to the Canadian Rockies. I was going to the Bugaboos. I wanted granite, I wanted glaciers, but I knew a lot of people in the Calgary Mountain Club, and I caught a ride up. I'd been in the Tetons, I got a ride up, was dropped off at Fraser Williamson's house near the Stampede grounds. It was a Wednesday when I arrived, my first day in Canada, and I had the address of Fraser's house. So Wednesday, those of you in the Mountain Club that know the Wednesdays is when the Calgary Mountain Club meets usually in a bar. But in the summertime, we also go to Okotoks Rock. So my first day in Canada, actually, First Bugs took me to the Highlander bar in 1971 for a beer. I'd never seen a bar like that coming from California. Then we went to Okotoks. And I think you'll notice in some of these old pictures, a lot of our climbers all had cigarettes in their mouths. So here we are at Okotoks. So we finished off after Okotoks, we went to the Empress Hotel, to the bar, and so that was my first day in Canada with the Mountain Club. And so here, and again, I just, how important these archives are. I've had access to a lot of the digital versions of this, but I also went back to a lot of the old newsletters that Chick and others had saved all these years. And so you get a sense of the early 70s, this is from 1971, Billy Davidson, George Homer, a Canadian climber and a British climber. And so some idea of what was going on back then when I arrived. And I thought, in thinking of my portion of this, of sort of pushing our limits, what was going on in climbing at the time, and one portion of it was pretty high level, extremely difficult, aid climbing on parts of Yamnuska, Gibraltar, and some of the other big faces here. And here, Billy Davidson, cigarette in mouth. And the other part that stands out is the pioneering of waterfall ice climbing. That a lot of the climbers, particularly a lot of the Brits initially, but so a lot of that was going on, and this was was going on sort of in the time that I first arrived here. And Chick's already told about some of the huts the club had been building in different locations. Another project that began in 1970, Archie Simpson, I think spearheaded this, in the valley behind Yamnuska, known as Loggers Valley or the CMC Valley. They took the remains, I think they literally rebuilt what was an old cabin slightly before I'd arrived. But I think the point is here that the Yamnuska hut, the CMC hut, became more than just a place for climbing. A lot of new climbs were put up on the crags back in the CMC Valley, and a lot of us spent a lot of time climbing there, but a lot of families went there. Climbers came with their partners, with their children, and a lot of really good memories from that particular location. And here, from the hut logbook, which is quite an amazing thing to go through and see, it's fairly disorderly after a while. But here, the Greenwood family. Brian went in with his daughter and sons and John Jones and did some climbing. They cleaned up the hut, which apparently was not in good shape when they arrived. So the importance of some of the other projects the club has been involved in. And so my first summer, I came in 1971. And again, when I came back in 72, the old clubhouse of the Alpine Club of Canada. And during that time, most of the mountain club, we didn't have the kind of money, we couldn't afford to actually stay in the proper rooms there. And there were a lot of other climbers from the States that had come up and were climbing that season. The club allowed us, I think we paid about $1 a night, and we could use the bathrooms and the showers, and we were allowed to sleep on the veranda or on the grounds, but we had to put all our gear away during the day and go off to go climbing, or often down to the Cascade Bar if we weren't climbing. But it was a really important mecca for all the climbers. So, okay, I already knew the mountain club. I'd met these characters in Yosemite, and I still was crazy enough to go climbing with them. And I told you I wanted to go to the Bugaboos. Brian Greenwood with the beer bottle here. The other person, that's Bugs McKeith that you last saw with fire coming out of his mouth. And I was climbing Bugs that season. And instead of going to the Bugaboos initially, and I did some rock climbs here in Alberta, and we took off. I think there were 8 of us, a couple climbers from the States. So because instead of the Bugaboos, we were going to the Gold Range south of Revelstoke first. We got lost on logging roads, went back to Revelstoke. I think we probably stopped in the bar to figure out what we were doing. Finally figured out where to go. Got to where the turnoff was till we could walk in to go climbing. Brian Greenwood said, let's go to the Bugaboos. And we left and went to the Bugaboos. This is written up, and George Homer wrote this up in a CMC newsletter, so it's true.
Really?
So I finally got to the Bugaboos, and we went in, and I did. It was a great time. I climbed a number of the classic routes with Bugs McKeith, and some of the others put up some new routes in the Bugaboos that year. And the Bugaboos attract. Some of you didn't know the Bugaboos back then. There was no big hut. This looks like the alien landing. There were 2 fiberglass igloos, and these are 2 outstanding mountain club members. John Jones and George Homer, and rather appropriate headgear there. I think if I'd arrived not knowing who they were, I might have turned around. And this picture, some of you, this has been published, and people wonder, why did I look so sad or depressed? I'm not sure what. But I'm on some summit, probably in the Bugaboos. I've got a summit register in my hand, and I'm looking rather upset. Well, my only explanation would be that if you knew Bugs McKeith, as some of you in the audience did know Bugs, he was an artist and rather fixated on sheep. And this is a nice one. This is one from a first ascent that Bugs and Mike Galbraith did. But the sheep in the summit registers that summer were getting increasingly rude. And I really didn't really like my name associated with that. So that might explain why I looked so depressed on that mountain peak. And again, Bugs and I, that summer decided, with Mike Galbraith, who's here tonight, Ian Rowe. Ian and Mike had just immigrated to Canada. They were old friends of Bugs's. We went off to climb the north face of Edith Cavell. I had no idea what a north face really was and constituted. But, and these are pictures directly, Mike took the photographs, I think, of them. They're from Bugs McKeith's actual scrapbook, which apparently is now in Bugs's daughter's house somewhere in Victoria at the moment. But these will do. Anyway, a nice record of the climb we did on Edith Cavell. And back to some of the other characters in the mountain club. Here we have Rob Wood, John Jones, Jerry Rogan, George Homer. And there were also Canadians involved in this. It wasn't just all Brits. On the left here, Timmy Odger, John Laughlin, Jack Firth, Bugs McKeith, and Rob Wood again. Really finely dressed, as you can tell. And I think it sort of caught on. My favorite orange anorak was rather looking like the ones we just saw on our other friends there. And another one of something that was going on, this was really in sort of 73, 74, 75, was the development of more of the waterfall climbing, and one of the pioneer of some of this is here tonight, Jack Firth. A number of climbs were done out of field, and they were all named after beers. There was Carlsberg Column, Pilsner Pillar, and I went along on the first ascent with Jack and with John Laughlin. This is called Massey's, and this was, I think Jack just told me tonight, this was a Yorkshire beer that he very much favored at the time. But the mountain club didn't just stick to vertical ice. Every winter for a while, the Canadians and the British had a hockey. Is it a match? I'm not sure. I don't know much about hockey. Anyway, they got on the horizontal ice. I think the people who were skating on their ankles are probably the Brits. But so this was for a number of years. It was a great event, sort of around New Year's time. And again, I think the important part about, for me, the memories I have, and that are still ongoing, of just a sense of a community with the club, with the people you climb with their families, their children, and other friends who came on that were part of it all. And this is a picture from '74. It was actually taken by Gary Jennings. A number of us had gone down to the valley, and Gary and Billy Davidson. Billy Davidson's the one on the right with his fingers up behind Bruce Keller's head. They had just climbed El Cap. And Bruce and John Laughlin and I walked up the backside to greet them and help them carry their gear down. But always a wonderful sense of community amongst this group. And, oops, let me go there. And in addition to the technical climbing taking place on some of the walls in the Rockies and the waterfall ice, Chick's already briefly mentioned that the big traverse, the Great Divide from Jasper out to Lake Louise that he was part of. I did the southern half of this back in 1976 with John Laughlin and two other friends. And it was that building on another sort of skill in the mountains that opened other horizons for me and some of the events that were next to come. And it was end of 1976 and coming into 1976, and once again we can look to Chick as sort of the leader in what was going on. The focus was on the St. Elias Mountains on the Yukon, and it was Chick was organizing an expedition to do a first ascent of the southwest buttress of Mount Logan. And some of the rest of us in the club thought, that sounds interesting. Maybe we'll think about going north. John Laughlin, Trevor Jones, John Calvert, and Mike Sawyer, they decided to go to Mount Vancouver in the same range. And then I thought, I think and so Chick's going to Logan, some of the other friends are going to Mount Vancouver. Mount Logan has an easy route up it. It's like sort of a walk-up route. And so I thought, okay, and I joked with Chick. I said, Chick, okay, I think I'll go because we can probably ski up Logan, and I'll meet you on top. Well, I think I hadn't quite reckoned on how big Logan really was. But I think the point also was at that time, our first sort of expeditions, and Chick was really leading the way, and he put together all these lists of the various suppliers that we might write to, sort of begging for gear to help us fund our expeditions. And it was that sense of community that I really value from that time. He shared these lists with all of us, and so we all packed up our gear. The Mount Logan group, which was all women, the first person I asked, Kathy Calvert, who's here tonight, and then in this slide here is Kathy Calvert, Sharon Wood, and I'm down there. We had just spent 3 days, I think, at least on the Alaska Highway with all of our gear and some of the men from the Mount Vancouver expedition, and we needed to get a bit of exercise before we went in the bar at the White Horse Inn. And at this time, we arrived, here's Mike Sawyer and John Laughlin doing some last-minute preparations, and I think we had at least 5 days waiting to fly in, to get the weather to fly in to Logan. And it gets kind of boring. So we briefly, I apologize for this, but it's already been it's a published photograph. So what else do you do? We didn't have access to showers, so we made a sauna on the shores of Lake Kluane. And some of the people here, they're not from our expedition. They were David Jones's expedition to Logan as well. So finally, we got to go. Chick's expedition. They arrived from Calgary just the night. On one night, and the next morning we heard a helicopter coming and we knew we're all flying into our respective mountains. And so the Mount Logan expedition, here our pilot, Rene Leduc, squatting in front is Kathy Langell, Kathy Calvert behind, Lorraine Drews, Sharon Wood, myself, Diana Knack took the picture. We used skis. In fact, we used almost the same gear you saw Donnie Gardner and Chick and the group in the big traverse, the big Jasper to Lake Louise traverse. We used essentially the same gear, but with double boots and on Logan because it was quite skiable. And this is at the end. I think we were out for about 28 days. We didn't make the main summit of Logan, but here we are on that's our igloo we built the month before with our extra gear in it, awaiting us. And the Mount Vancouver crew was very successful in making a new route. Mike Sawyer and John Laughlin on the left. Unfortunately, Chick's expedition to the south-southwest buttress did not succeed. And then another part, because we all had sort of this going north fever that year, going to the Yukon, to the St. Elias Range. Well, Bugs McKeith, in a very Bugs fashion, he decided, well, what's going to happen to all the rest of us that weren't invited on any of your trips? So he organized a group to go to Denali in Alaska called CLOD, Calgary Leftovers on Denali. And I mentioned a few minutes ago that when we all first started talking about climbing Mount Logan, I sort of naively said, "Oh, hi, Chick. Okay, we'll ski up and meet you on the top of Logan." Well, that didn't come to be. But actually, in 1979, I returned to Logan as part of a high altitude physiology study. And I had a chance to go to the summit of Logan with some of the other volunteers. And en route that summer, Jim Elzinga, John Laughlin, Adrian Burgess, and Ray Jodaran were attempting yet again the southwest buttress of Logan. And I knew they were on the mountain, and in fact, some of us were quite a bit concerned about we hadn't heard from them. And on my way, passing under the west summit of Logan, I saw two people coming down. It was John Laughlin and Jim Elzinga. So I actually met up with two mountain clubbers on Mount Logan. And certainly Mount Logan, a number of people in the mountain club have climbed different routes, particularly the east ridge of Mount Logan over the last number of years. The Junior Boys Choir, an important group for the mountain club, sort of the younger grouping, and here they are in the early 1980s looking all quite presentable. And we had a lot of Brits coming over, but one of those Brits was Elaine Brooke. So she and I did some climbing here in the Rockies, and we decided, and I think after Mount Logan, which I'm really glad I did it, but it was a lot of work, writing letters, trying to organize equipment, finding planes to fly you onto a glacier, and it's quite complicated. And things were getting more complicated in climbing life, it seemed. And so Elaine, I was off to Peru to study archaeology for a semester with the university, and before I left, Elaine said, well, I'll meet you in Peru in May, and let's go climbing. So we had minimal amount of gear. She showed up. We went to Bolivia, to the Quimsa cruise where Elaine had climbed the year before, and we hitched a ride on a truck up to the mining village with some of the Aymara, the native people, the indigenous people there are Aymara-speaking people, and we hitched a ride up to the mining settlement where they were all living. And we asked them, we said, if any climbers been in here in the last few years? And they said, well, not this year, but last year there were some Japanese women, and they pointed out the peak that they'd climbed. Well, that's interesting. And Elaine and I found another peak, Maya Chuma, which we wound up making the first ascent of it. And it was just, I look back at it so fondly because, as we'll see in a minute, and we think about climbing, as more and more expeditions got bigger and bigger, more competitive, this was just such a wonderfully simple trip to be in some part of the world. No one knew where we were, who we were, and we just had a wonderful time. So things got a bit bigger at that point, and several people in the audience know this particularly well. In 1982, Canadian expedition to Mount Everest. And I don't know if you can recognize them from these pictures here, Laurie Skreslet and Pat Morrow. But other things were still going on during that time. And here we have, in the 80s, Kathy Calvert, Sylvia Forrest, Lynn Whyte, and Martha McCallum, they skied from the Rogers Pass to the Bugaboo. So not everything was sort of big mountains at the time. All sorts of activities were happening. And back to Everest again. 1986, Everest Light, a bit more scaled down expedition to Everest. And as I think most of us know, Sharon Wood and Dwayne Congdon reached the summit of Everest in 86. And briefly back to Logan again. In 1993, Andrea Petzel, Sylvia Forrest, and Leanne Allison and Mary Clayton climbed the east ridge of Logan. Sylvia here enjoying a bit of exuberant moment somewhere on Logan. And another interesting expedition, I don't really know. This one, I think they called it, the title to this picture, Dress to Climb, Red Heels and Skirts. And these were the expeditions to Choyu and Amadevlan, and mountain club members were involved in that one. And finally, the mountain club keeps going, and recently Kathy Langell came out and got the club together again, and the women from Logan, unfortunately Lorraine Drews died a few years ago, but the rest of us got together at Sharon Wood's house in Canmore. And the community goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. That was wonderful trip down memory lane. So let's see. Yay! So take it to the limit. This is the 80s, the Calgary Mountain Club. And no, I'm not taking it to the limit, but I was there. I wasn't the climber. During these years, some of these years, I was president of the club. So I was right there, but I was organizing the mountain club parties, not doing the climbing. But these are the guys from the mountain club who were doing the climbing. Barry, you all know Barry. Kevin Doyle. Just a fabulous collection of just the hardest of the hardcore. Dave Cheeseman. Steve DeMaio. Jeffrey Jr. Dr. Risk. Jeffrey Marshall. Tim Friesen. Sweet Tim, but he could climb. Chalk Quinn, the Irishman. And the two Brians, Brian Gross in the white helmet and Brian Wallace in the red. And these were the guys during the 80s who really, they took Canadian climbing to the limit. They really did. They put up the first grade 7 waterfall routes. There was Riptide that Jeff Marshall and his pals put up on Mount Patterson, but there was this one too, Gimme Shelter on Quadra and Biden above Consolation Lake. Grade 7 ice, the world had never seen it. And here's Tim Friesen on Gimme Shelter. And then there was Yam. Of course, the Calgary Mountain Club has always been and still is in love with Yam. So this is Carl Nagy's photograph from Tiratisma, looking over at Jeff Marshall leading and Brian Wallace Belaine on Astro Yam on Suicide Wall. Pretty steep. And that's how steep it was. Really steep. Really incredible climbing. This is on Above and Beyond. And that shows the passion of those guys. Steve DeMaio, Brian Gross, and Jeff Marshall at the top of Above and Beyond. And just the energy and the passion. Incredible. And as well as ice climbing and rock climbing, there was alpine climbing, Andromeda Strain right up the middle there on Mount Andromeda. There's the classic photograph of Tim Friesen right at the top, right near the top. And then, so this is just a selection of 20 or 30 climbs. East face of Mount Fay, right up those streaks of ice. Here's Barry leading up one of those streaks. And here's a photo of Barry, who's still climbing and guiding, although he's into his 60s, well into his 60s now. Pretty hardcore. And here's the north face of North Goodsir, I think. And Dave Cheeseman and Kevin Doyle put a route up that. And here's Kevin's picture, I think that's Dave, coming up at the top. And then there's the north face of North Twin, maybe the granddaddy of all those alpine routes, Dave Cheeseman and Barry. Just one photo here of Barry. Like how many pitches? 40, 50, 60 pitches? I mean, once they were halfway up, there was no way they wouldn't have had enough hardware to repel the face. They were just committed. Pretty amazing. And then the same group of guys started to travel elsewhere. Here's Kevin's picture of Barry on the Cassin Ridge on Denali. And here's a fabulous picture. Boy, does that look cool. That's Kevin at the top of Denali. The two of them climbed to Alpine style, a great climb. And then they went to France. Both Kevin and Barry loved France, loved the climbing, loved the culture, as did I. And here's Barry in the BLA campground at Chamonix, and there's Kevin same place, and they climbed all sorts of great routes over there in the French Alps and other places. And one of the most notable, actually, it was Kevin with a British partner. He did the first Canadian ascent of the north face of the Eiger in 1983. And then they went to the Himalayas, these guys, to this one, Rakaposhi, just a little under 8,000 meters, but a huge north face on it. Here they are at the airport. It was a fairly big team. They were going to climb it sort of moving siege style up this big ridge. Some exciting campsites. It was a hell of a climb, but you know, they didn't get to the top. Their time was almost over. They were all ready to go home, and the weather cleared. And three of them, Kevin, Barry, and Dave Cheeseman, decided to go for it, just alpine style, and they did it, up and down. I forget how many days, but this is what they looked like when they came down. They had just really taken it to the limit. Pretty hardcore. Calgary Mountain Club guys. There they are. And Dave. And then they took it one step farther to Pakistan, to the 9th highest mountain in the world, Nanga Parbat. And they were going to climb this face, the Rupal face of Nanga Parbat, which some say is the highest mountain wall in the world. It's 5,000 meters, or about 16,000 feet. And they were going to climb it alpine style. You just put a pack on your back, you go to the top, and you come down all the way. No fixed ropes, no fixed camps. And they almost did it. This is 1988. They got to this point, not far below the summit, maybe 1,000, 1,500 feet below the summit. They were going to do it. It would have been the greatest climb of the year in the whole world for sure. And a storm came in and dropped snow and hail, and right above this gully that they're in was a big snowfield, a big ice field, and it just collected it all and channeled it right down the gully. They are so lucky that they got out of it alive. It's the most epic story almost in Canadian mountaineering. They did come back alive, but they didn't quite make it, but they came back alive. Meanwhile, while these guys were all doing these outstanding feats, I was organizing some of the parties, and great parties. So this is our annual barbecue in the meadows below Yamnuska, you know, that little lake there. Before they put up the barrier, you used to be able to go in there and camp. And we would get 100 or 150 people at our barbecues. With kids and families. We also had big annual dinners at the Danish Canadian Club where people put on plays. Here's Saul Greenberg and Judy and Rory McIntosh, Martha and Bobbis, I think. Anyways, yeah, they put on a play. I forgot. I saved all the plays. So there was about 4 plays written by Brian Wyville and Jeff Powder, and they're all here in the CMC archives. That's where they ended up. And we had our Christmas parties at the Bankview Community Association. Lots of dancing, lots of partying. And here's a fabulous picture. I like that one. That's Sean Doherty and Joni Cooper. Joni Cooper ended up for about 4 years being the director of the Banff Mountain Film Festival. But there they are. And Sean actually is the director of ALMA, which is an array of about 55 radio telescopes at 5,000 meters on the plateau in Chile, giant radio telescopes that are mapping the universe. Amazing guy, Sean. Anyways. And so one of the last big parties that I organized or helped organize was the 1987 annual dinner. And we handed out the first club honorary memberships to Don Vockroth, Brian Greenwood, Don Forrest, and Glenn Bowles. Here we are, handing out the honorary memberships, and I published my first book, which is on sale out in the gift store. $20, cheap. There's a few left, but not many. So if you want one, or you want an extra one for your kids, get one, because they won't last for long. Anyways, I came out with the book, and I sort of got it right at the peak. You wouldn't have known it at the time, of course, that it was, but it was sort of the peak of the club, because the next year, this guy, Brian Rawlis, died climbing high on the north face of Mount Lougheed. And the year before that, 1987, Dave Cheeseman had disappeared high on the Hummingbird Ridge on Mount Logan. And that sort of took the steam out of the Calgary Mountain Club, losing those two guys. Kevin Doyle had sort of retired from extreme alpinism after Nanga Parbat in '88. Barry Blanchard, by then, was full into his guiding career. He was living in Canmore, and the leading climbers of that time, the late '80s, didn't really want to live in Calgary anymore. They wanted to live in the mountains. And although Steve DeMaio and Jeff Marshall continued to do some pretty hardcore routes for another 2 or 3 years, that was sort of the high point. So I moved to the mountains too in the late 80s. I quit my job of 13 years at the university in the labs there, and I went back to the life of being a mountain adventurer, and I went up to the mountains, and I met this guy, Andrew Brash. He had come out from Hamilton, where he grew up, and he was coming out to have his adventures in the Rocky Mountains, and we met, and we lived together even for a while, and we had some adventures.
Platonically.
What's that?
Not
But anyways, I stayed in the mountains. He came to Calgary to get an education, to go to university, and he joined the Calgary Mountain Club, as he would, and he's going to take it from here.
Thanks, everybody. So now that the steam has been taken out of the club, I enter the situation. It was about probably 8 months, or I don't know, a while ago. Chick asked me if I would do this, and he said, "You joined the club in 1993, right? Why don't you take it from there?" And I thought, wow, great. And I started thinking, can I do this and everything? And I thought, oh yeah, the 80s, a lot happened in the 80s. I was thinking, the 90s, what happened in the 90s? And I started thinking, oh boy, this might not be that great an assignment after all. And I asked a couple people, you know Jeff Marshall? I asked Jeff, what, can you think of anything big that happened in climbing from the club? 1993 on. He said, well, I stopped really doing anything art in 1992. And he said, F all happened. Except, he didn't say F all, obviously, but. So I thought, oh boy, thanks, Chick. This is going to be a tough assignment. But obviously some things did happen. So I'll try to explain those. So the recent history, the last 31 years, when the steam was gone and nothing happened. Some of us endeavored to keep the club alive. And I think if one person gets the credit for this, it's this guy, Ken Weens. Ken, of anybody in the club, has kept it alive. He's put in so much effort over the years. All the communications. He was president for a few years, but in a way, he's really been the president the whole time. So I think we should actually, he's not here tonight, he's in Costa Rica, retired, but we should thank him from afar, because he might see this video. Come on. And we kept it rolling. We had, I thought, who was president all of a sudden? So we took some time to remember, to try to figure out who was president from 1993 on. So Jenneru, I don't remember this, but he was president for a couple of years. Andrea, the great Andrea Petzel, for a couple of years. Ken for 3. The terms start getting longer and longer because nobody wants to do the job. Maya Swanee, who's here. couple of great, glorious years. Ken Brinkak, he's here tonight too, President Ken. Kevin West is wisely retired to Nova Scotia. The tyrannical reign of Eric Hoogstraat for 2 years. Howard Bentley for 4. Couldn't get rid of the guy. Marshall came in for a couple of years. Then we had 3 one-termers. 3 George H.W. Bushes in a row. And then after that, Rudy, 5-year term. It's getting more, I don't know, is that United Nations? I don't know what that is. But basically, long term, if they wanted to keep doing it, great. Keep being president. She finally left in 2020. We finally got rid of her. And Keith Grimes came in during COVID, and Keith has done an outstanding job. Keith is another guy keeping the club alive. Thanks, Keith. So he's moving into his 5th year next year. And Keith, just 5 more, okay? 5 more years, that's all we ask. We're going for the 10-year prime ministerial terms. So there's a bit of a collage of people I could find from that list. So fine-looking bunch, eh? Even Howard. And I thought I should mention Evan Jones, who's been the treasurer of the club through the last 31 years, basically the whole time, without complaining once or anything like that, and doing the job. He finally handed it off to other people, but let's thank Evan too, because we actually have money to them. And yeah, people kept climbing. It was not quite the 80s where people were, world class exactly, but good climbers in our club. Real trad climbers who could still do good routes. Pierre Champnez, Darren Williams, Brad Warren, these guys are great climbers, and they kept climbing all this time. And Dornian and Joe Josephson went and did a couple of giant routes in the Yukon back in 2005. Mount MacArthur, those routes are 7,500 feet high, and Catenary Peak in the Yukon, beautiful routes. So yeah, good stuff kept happening. And the perennial favorite, East Ridge of Logan, got done at least once by people. This is Ken Weens and Al Derbyshire and crew, who were up there. There's that one with his pee bottle. And Alan was active this entire time, still is as far as I know. Alan?
Yeah.
Yep. This is his ridiculous traverse of Yamnuska, which is about 85 pitches. How many years did that take you, Alan?
I think we were up there 12 times, so over a year, maybe.
Oh, only 1 year, 12 times. Okay. That's actually more impressive than I thought. We had some great partnerships who, frequented the club once in a while. Steve Birch and Jesse Bulliani were actually a really hardcore climbing partnership. And we had some, the Greenwood Lock on Mount Temple it's a Calgary Mountain Club route, incredibly. So we had people trying to repeat that route from within the club. That arrow there, I don't know if you can see the lines on that drawing, but the white line is the Greenwood Lock, the arrow is pointing to it. So we had a couple guys trying to repeat the route, and they got a little off route, and they were over there. And they finally got back on route at the last 20 feet of the face and rejoined, but they ended up with a new route. That's the name of it, you can see right there. A very dangerous, loose, difficult route, but sometimes accidents turn out to be quite good. So there we go. Some climbing action, but by accident. And some of us kept trying to do the expedition thing because myself, I was very inspired by, when I first came to the club, I thought, I can't even be in the same room with these guys. It's so nerve-wracking. They're legends, I'd read about all of them, and I thought, I just want to do some of the things these guys have done. So some of us tried to go on expeditions. I went on quite a few, and just mostly, it was harder to get people from the club to go. I think that energy of the communal energy was not what it used to be. So people started doing their own thing a bit more. And I had my own adventures, which was, I always enjoyed that very much. The club also became subject of a movie about Yamnuska. How many people saw that movie? Okay, so the club members that I was with watching this, I think a lot of us had a slight issue with the way one of our members, Andy Jenneru, was portrayed in the movie. I just wanted to mention him for a minute because Andy, I mean, you want to talk about a prolific climber, a guy who's done thousands of new pitches, probably thousands of new routes, developed this new style of opening up blank terrain by climbing with a drill. Picture this, if you haven't tried it, picture this. You've got a big heavy drill hanging around you and you're launching off onto unknown terrain and you can't always stop to drill a bolt wherever you want. Andy's been doing this for a long time. He's a bold guy. I've seen him in action. It's amazing what he does. And for him to be, accused of being sort of the
Mad bolter.
the mad bolter, the destroyer of Yamnuska, is not true in my books. It's a disservice to Andy. So I wanted to give Andy a shout out, even though he's not here. He's probably in Greece or something, or I don't know.
Knee replacement.
Knee replacement surgery. So there's Andy. And a lot of our members have become pillars of the community. They've gone on to be the guidebook authors. They've begun to be the speakers. We'll get to some of the other things they've done in a bit, but the guidebook authors. So, Andy's books there, John Martin and John Jones' sport climbing books, they become authors of memoirs. Lots of guidebooks. There's Chris Berry's Bow Valley Rock, Powder's book, Berry's, and Sharon, lots of them. If you Google Chick Scott books, this is page 1 of his stuff, and that's not all his books. The Chick just keeps writing and writing and writing and writing. It's unbelievable. So hats off to Chick for really propping up all of us, I think, as a community. And I think we've been recognized, or the long-standing members have been recognized by the wider community. This is a list of all the Summit of Excellence award winners that are club members, the Banff Film Festival, Summit of Excellence, since 1993. Big list, as you can see. Here's a few guys I think probably should have got the award. Oops. Going back, so you guys know Tabs, of course. Dick Howe and Mike Mortimer, who really, in a way, built the hut system in the Canadian Rockies. They're responsible for a huge list of huts, upgrading huts, building huts. Tabs and Dick Howe doing a lot of the building, and Mike doing a lot of the fundraising and organizing. So these guys, somebody should nominate them, even though we know that Tabs and Dick have passed away now. That's the bow hut that they worked on. Another big CMC member who had a hand in the most recent hut in the Rockies is Richard Guy. And from the estate of Louise and Richard Guy, this Louise and Richard Guy hut was built in the Des-Palus Glacier area. Yes? Sort of a final hut to the Wapta Traverse, an extension. And Mike Mortimer became the president of the Union of International Alpine Associations back in 2006, which is kind of mind-boggling. If you know Mike, he's a good wheeler and dealer kind of guy, but this is the top alpine club position in the world, and he led this for 6 years. And I think he won by 1 vote the first time around, and then the second time, unanimous win for him becoming president. So he became quite popular. And John Jones started this thing called TABVAR, which is the Association of Bow Valley Area Rock Climbers. They fundraise for, hardware for upgrading rock climbs. And I mentioned already that he was the author of the local sport climbing book after having a long career as an expeditioner. Culture of the club, I think it remained the same. A lot of people like to drink. They like to goof around. They like to crack jokes with each other. Dave Dornian, I think, really kept that side of things going for about 20 years after 1993. And we loved Dave's newsletter, the world's best club newsletter. Did you keep your copies of that?
Yes.
I obviously did, because I took that picture of one of my old newsletters. So read that headline. I was going to read it. When it's rock or resin, then it's chalk and tights. But come the cold, you want.
That's on ice.
Thank you. Machinations of suffering. And another classic. Okay, cowgals, show us that you're local. What's bite-sized, cheap, and easily had in any Bow Valley tavern? Come on now, comes buffalo, hot, or suicide. Right you are, it's a short order of wings. Who are we talking about? Jeff Marshall. That's Jeff, short order of wings. And then, of course, there's his friend Glenn. And do you guys remember this incident? Mid-90s. Jeff and Glenn were trying to climb Grand Central Couloir on Mount Kitchener. And Jeff was tunneling through the cornice right at the very top. And Glenn had a belay-in of 2 ice screws that were not that great, and 1 stew-by tool that was beaten into the middle of the belay. And Jeff could not turn the cornice. He fell off with, of course, no gear in at all. And he took a 150-foot fall from the top of Grand Central and whammed onto the belay and ripped everything out except for that stew-by. And then Dave made fun of the whole thing in his newsletter. But they barely lived. So anyway, great times. So people were still doing things. And then there was the constant irreverence towards mountain guides from the Calgary Mountain Club. Sorry if there's any mountain guides in here, but you get made fun of a lot. And Dave came up with this thing, Ask a Guide. And this is classic stuff. Abel von Beta is the name of the mountain guide. Very Germanic. And then we had exclusive access to Tammy Knight cartoons, such as this one that I think was riffing on Mark Whyte. Roger the master, what is it? Hyper-conscious master of the extreme. Roger seeks ultra realities in the lukewarm cocktail of despair. It is but in the Alpine that my soul is at liberty. And Big Bad Bubba Barry's bad poetry pages. Did you see Barry up there in the corner? The mountain was just like a beautiful woman. She made me feel like orange jello. I can't read the rest of that. Anyway, there's a cartoon. There's one of Alex Lowe abuses a limerick. And anyway, this was great stuff. We had, Dave, could you ever do this again? We need another one of these, just for old time's sake.
I don't think it's allowed.
It's not allowed, yeah. No, I mean, are you reading that limerick? I once tooled a column of ice. Okay. The dinners and dances continued. They were a little smaller than the ones Chick had pictures of in the 80s. This was the auxiliary room now at the Danish Canadian Center, but we're still there. You can see people still having a fun time there. And Alan kept going with the Big Rock cleanup every year, passing beer cans out from the cracks at Okotoks Rocks. And we got a website, although nobody seems to be able to put a picture the right way around. And bow hut trips kept going, and we're not the best skiers probably, but you can see here Murray is just happy he's standing upright when he skis. This was a ghosts weekend, I believe, and somebody thought the river didn't look too bad. I can cross that river, and that didn't work out so well. I think that vehicle, was it a Range Rover? It was a pretty nice car, I think. That was gone. Barbecues, we still have those every year. We're in the Ghost now. The Amnuska thing, as you know, we can't do anymore, so we're in the Ghost in a hidden location, far away from everyone. We have our stalwart members who are there at every event, every meeting. Howard Bentley, amazing guy. Doyle is still coming out. Dick Howe was always out until he passed away. Choquette used to come out all the time. And now thanks to Keith and Peter McNeil, they have upped the ante for barbecue. There's a full pig roast that happens now. I think you can see the body there. that Keith is handling. And anyway, that's something spectacular, really incredible. And then, a lot of our members now they're retiring. They're going to retirement kind of places. Jeff Marshall lives in Victoria. That's where he is. And I met him this summer out there. That's him saying hi to everybody with a pint of beer in his Calgary Mountain Club glass. So he's saying hi to everybody. Weens is down in Costa Rica a lot now. He smuggles his own liquor into the whatever bar he's going to. And some of the club members like to go to Kalymnos in Greece. This is Brenda Critchley, who didn't come tonight, but Dave's here. And there's some of the CMC crew in Greece not too long ago. Andy Generu, and that's Tim Poche. John Quinn and Brian Weibel, Blob. Still climbing really hard. And when we're not climbing and doing all those things, we love to sit around and talk about it, right? We're still doing this. So this is 2010, this poster, when Chick and a bunch of people from the club did a 50th anniversary show at the U of C. How many people were there? Okay, well, then you won't remember this. The greatest technological achievement.
Don't encourage me, otherwise we won't even get to the speakers tonight. We won't even get to the speakers tonight.
Anyway, they'll take you back. So the following year, I decided I would take over the slideshow duties. And we've hosted over 50 shows since then. So the club has kept that going. And we've had great speakers in. And so, Banff Film Festival, forget about it. We've got it covered in Calgary. We've had a good time with those. So hopefully we can get that going. We've been at the Ironwood Bar and Grill in Calgary and Inglewood. There's Stas Beskin giving a show. We sometimes get 150 people there. So it's quite well attended. We have a good laugh usually. You can see the crowd. And Richard Guy, I mentioned to you, he was with the club until he was 103. And he passed away in 2020. He came to a show 2 months before he died. He just kept coming to the shows. And he loved to chat up the speakers afterwards. So I asked him with Will Gadd having a word after his show. And there he is talking to Jeff Powder after his show. And Pat Morrow, who's right there after Pat's show. So Richard is dearly missed. But the slideshows are definitely part of the culture. Laurie Skreslet, who's in the back, graciously gave a show as well. The bartender there on the left, Pat McIntyre, has hosted us for 30 years now at various bars, and he owns the Ironwood, so we're with him now. And he was quite enamored with Laurie, and he's trying to tell him a story here. And Laurie's, as you can see, not quite sure about this, and he's going for it more and more. Laurie's still not really with him, but nailed the punchline. Finally won him over. So we've had some really good nights there. We even have the CMC room at the Ironwood. Yeah, look at that. We've got the big logo thing there on the wall and some displays that have old ice climbing gear. Brian Greenwood's ice axe on the right. And a trophy case. And there's our trophy case. The Cheapskate Award at the top. And what else do we have? The Wings Award. People have taken gigantic falls off things. The YAM 100 Award. 3 people, we figure, have climbed 100 individual climbs on Yamnuska. Alan is one. Andy Generu and Shaw Quinn. And then there's the Sport Drinking Award. There's 2 cups for that. Bottom right. And Chick, he's done a lot. He's won that twice. Congratulations. Who will win next? Will it be somebody tonight? As we know, with an aging population, aging club, that we've had many people pass on. And we take it very personally each time that happens. And I can't go through everybody here, but I'm going to talk about a couple of people who've passed away recently. Dick Howe and Tabs. And so when Dick Howe passed away in 2018, Tabs decided that a bench should be built in his honor. And the bench was built and carted up to the top of an ice climb called This House of Sky in this location in the Ghost River area. Then a forest fire came through and burned the bench down to the ground. Disappeared. And so those guys did it again. They built the bench again and took it back up again. And that's its current situation. That's the way it looks right now. And so there's the little plaque that's on the bench, and there is a group of people visiting the bench. So Tabs passed away in 2022, and that caused a big group of us to go out to the bench. So you can see it's a good turnout. And a couple of, I don't know, an hour or two walk to get up there. And there's the bench, and you can see Ken Weens is a little contemplative there. And we're just taking a rest once we get up there. There's Peter Roxborough up at the bench, 89 years old, got all the way up there, still going really well. And we're all having a drink. And then this is the group of us spreading Tab's ashes in the creek above This House of Sky. So the community part of it is still there, very much. People care about each other. I think safe to say it feels like a big family. And I've frozen the thing again. The good news is we only have 2 slides more. So if you ever want to hike, go up to this bench. It's a good spot. It's probably quiet most of the time in the summer. And then I'm sure you can stop there if you do the ice climb in the winter. So Ken Weens told me that before Tabs died, he told him that him and Dick Howe had a talk just before Dick passed away, that, you know, Dick Howe, I don't know if you know, he's Scottish. He was Scottish, and Tabs is English. That they agreed that in the afterlife, they would meet every year around the time of the CMC barbecue for a drink at Hadrian's Wall. And so that was part of what we did. We went up around the time of the barbecue, and we had a toast for those guys up there at the bench. So I thought, in closing, I know we don't all have a drink in our hands, but maybe a virtual toast or raise your hand. And I'll just say, here's to a club like no other club. And long live the CMC. Thank you.